you'll see that we're now displaying the property type for this data point, as well as the city and the price of it. And then if I'm to hover over different values, you'll see it will update accordingly. Hello, my name is Lachlan Kirkwood, and today I'll be teaching you everything you need to know about building scatter charts in Bubble. Using the Chart.JS plugin by Techblocks, I'll be walking you through the process of creating a series of different scatter charts to help visualize any data you have stored within your database or data that you perhaps like to add as a static value. Whether you're an experienced Bubble developer or you're just getting started, this tutorial will help you take your scatter charts to the next level. Throughout our tutorial today, I'll be walking you through the step-by-step instructions to creating both single and multi-series scatter charts, and these can be both powered by a static or dynamic data source. I'll also be explaining how we can create our own custom tooltips to inspect data that's being displayed within a chart, as well as custom data labels to easily identify the values within a chart. I'll also be walking us through the process of creating a connected scatter chart, a time series scatter chart, and then finally how we can create both hover and click events when a user interacts with a chart. There's a lot that I want to cover throughout this tutorial, so grab your Bubble editor and let's get started. Throughout our tutorial today, I'm going to be running us through the process of creating a series of different scatter charts. And just to help us keep track of where we are throughout our build, I've added a list of all the different styles of charts that we will be creating in a Notion doc here. Whenever you're creating a build within Bubble, I always recommend to create your own checklist, as it just allows you to keep track of where you are and also just help measure your progress along the way. Now, the first scatter chart I would like to build today on our list is just a single series scatter chart based on a static data source. And now what I mean by a static data source is that this chart will display data points based on values that we manually add in ourselves, not values that we're extracting from our database. And a good use case for static charts is if you're creating something like a simple visualization on a marketing landing page, or something else like an infographic where the values won't need to change within the chart. You just like to create a static representation of something to display to users. So let's jump on into our Bubble editor here. And then before we add in the chart, what you'll need to do first is install the Chart.JS plugin, which will allow you to create a series of enriched charts. And as I mentioned today, we'll be focusing on the scatter charts themselves. So if you head over to your plugins tab here, you'll just need to open up your plugin library and search for the Chart.JS plugin. I already have this one installed here, but this is the Chart.JS plugin built by Techblocks. And what I love about this Chart.JS plugin is just the level of detail throughout all of the documentation. So once you've installed the plugin, you can see there's a link here to view some examples of different types of charts. You'll see that there's no shortage of examples for visualizations that you can create using the Chart.JS plugin. And already you'll know that these are much more visually enticing than some of the standard charts you can create with the default Bubble chart plugin. And while you're in this demo page, you'll see, if I move my head out of the way here, you can also access this editor, which just allows you to further inspect how the data sources and configurations are set up for each chart here. But there's also a link to further documentation to help throughout the process. But if I jump back into Bubble here, just move my head back across, and then open up my design tab, the first chart I would like to create is just the static single series scatter chart. So before I add in our chart element with the new elements from our plugin, I'd like to add in a group element onto our page here. And the reason I'm adding a group is because I'd like to update the style of this to be the default group border option, just so there's a white background behind our chart. And then I can scroll on over to our visual elements and add in the chart scatter point element. And that of course will be displayed once you've installed the Chart.JS plugin. I can then choose to drag this chart out, and I'll be updating the name of this to be called scatter point chart static single series. And within the element inspector for this chart, you'll see that there's no shortage of customizations that you can add yourself. What I will be doing first though is just updating where I'll be showing my legend for this chart. I personally just prefer to show this at the bottom of the chart. And then before I change any of the other configurations, what I'd like to do is just add a data source to this chart. So if I scroll right down to the bottom of our chart here, you'll see that we can add in our own custom data series. And for this example, what I'd like to do is create a scatter chart that just displays data points based on the price of properties in comparison to the square footage of each property. So I'll be updating my series name here to be called property prices. And then once I've added a series name, I can move on down to the X values here and start to add in the values of the square footage. So in this case, I'm just going to add in 7 different numbers, which will be the square footage for a particular property. So I'll just start with 120, 170, 240, 255, 275, 310, and then also 340. And now once I've added in the square footage for the properties, what I'd like to do is add in a list of prices to match the square footage that we've just created. So if I just remove the current Y values stored in our series here, I can now add in a list of static prices which will correspond with the relevant square footage. So if I was to add in 7 unique numbers separated by commas, each of these values would align with the X values for our square footage. So I could say that for a 120 square foot property, the price of this could be $275,000. So I'll just add in 275,000. I'll add a comma and add in another value. And then for a property that's 170 square feet, I could say that that's $292,000. Then for 240 square feet, I could say that's $310,000. 255 square feet could be $340,000. For 275 square feet, I could say this is $375,000. And then for 310 square feet, I could say that's $410,000. And then finally for 340 square feet, I could say that's $450,000. And after adding in these static values, we can take a quick preview as to what this chart looks like within our development environment. Over in our demo editor here, you can see our scatter chart with the square footage on our x-axis and the price on our y-axis. And then of course we have all the different data points based on the cost of the property in relation to the square footage that it has. But at the moment, this chart is looking fairly basic. So what I'd like to do is jump back into our bubble editor and make a few different customizations to make this look a bit more visually enticing. So if I open up our bubble design tab here, the first thing I'd like to do is update the point color that we're using to display all of the different data points within our chart. I'd like to update the color of this to be a purple. And then I will also update the point border color to also be that same purple. If I would like, I could update the point style to be a triangle. And then if I scroll on down, we can also update the style of the font that's displayed within our legend. So I could update the font itself to be Poppins 500. And if I'd like, I could set the font size to be 16. Now, if we preview our demo editor again, we can see some of those changes that we've just made. So right now you can see that the style of the data points has changed to our purple triangles. But there's one other change that I would like to add to this chart, and that is adding some metrics behind or in front of the labels for our X and Y series on our chart. So at the moment on our X series, we're just displaying a number of different square footage, but these are just being displayed as raw numbers. There's nothing indicating to users that that is a metric of square footage. And the same also goes for our y-axis here, where we're just displaying numbers, whereas I would like these to actually display currency. So the way we can edit this is by once again just jumping in our design tab, and if we scroll on up within our element inspector here, you'll see an option to edit the axis settings within your scatter chart here. And what you can do is customize the value that's displayed either before or after the axis value. So for our y-axis, what I'd like to do is display a $sign before that, because we are measuring that as a price of properties. And then if I scroll on down to our X unit, what I'd like to do is display the abbreviation of square footage after the X series values. So if we were to now once again preview our bubble editor, we can now identify on our chart what these particular metrics mean. But for now, that's all I'd like to add on to our first scatter chart today. So if I jump back into my Notion doc, I can check off that we've finished adding in our static single series scatter chart. And I'd like to move on to the next chart within our build, which is a single series scatter chart once again. But this time the values for this chart will be pulled dynamically from our database. So if I open up my bubble editor once again and open up my data tab here, I have a data type within my database which is recording a series of property price data. So this is quite similar to the example I had just shown you with our static scatter chart. And essentially within this data type, what I have is I'm registering the city of the property, there's the price of the property, the type of property, and then the square footage of that property, which of course is a number. And if I was to open up my app data here and just zoom on in, I can see that I've added in a list of test data for this particular example. So I'm just recording data for cities like New York, San Francisco, LA, and Texas. And I have some prices of properties, the different property types, so whether it's an apartment, a home, or a loft, and then the square footage for each property. If you'd like to follow along with a similar example in our build today, I'd recommend pausing the tutorial and just manually adding in this data within your database right now through the new entry button. But I'm going to jump back over into my design tab because I would like to show you how we can create a dynamic single series scatter chart. So once again, I'll be adding in a group element into our page, and this will be the background for my chart. I'll be updating the style to be the group border option. Might just expand that down a tad. And then I'll be once again adding in a scatter chart from the Chart.JS plugin element. I'll drag that out within our group. And I'll be calling this chart a chart scatter point, dynamic, single series. And like last time, the first thing I'll do is update where I'm showing my legend within this chart to be positioned at the bottom. And then if I scroll right down to our data source for this particular chart, instead of adding in a list of static options, what I'll need to do is reference data stored within my database. And one thing I'd like to just point out is that if you're creating a scatter chart with the Chart.js plugin, if that chart is just a single dynamic value, you can in fact identify your data source within the element inspector here. But if you'd like to create a multi-series scatter chart, which I'll be covering in a moment, you'll need to leverage the workflow editor to load data within that chart. But as I mentioned, I'll be explaining that in more detail in a moment when we get to that step in our tutorial. But what I'd like to do first is just remove the static values from our X series. And for my example in this dynamic chart, I would once again like to display a list of property prices based on their square footage. Only this time I'll be pulling that data from my database. So I'll choose to insert dynamic data here, and I'd like to search through my database for all of the property price data I have. And then for our X value, what I'd like to do is just display all of the square footage that we have stored for our properties. It's as simple as that. And then for our Y value, I would like to once again insert dynamic data, perform a search in our database for all of the property price data. And then from here, what I would like to do is display the price of those properties. So I'll select the price option. I will then also just update the series name to once again be called property prices. And then we can preview what this chart looks like within our demo editor. So if we scroll on down to our chart here, I can see that we have a very similar scatter chart to our first static example. Only this time we're now displaying dynamic values that we have stored within our database. So you can see I have a series of different properties, and these are being mapped out based on the price for their square footage. But at the moment, this visualization doesn't really give me any insight into the city of the properties as well as the property type. If I was someone looking to, let's say, buy the best value for money property, I'd like to know where the location of the property is, what type of property this is. So is it a house or an apartment? And that would just help me identify where I could potentially move to get the best value for my money. And so the way I'd like to display this information is by creating a custom tooltip. So at the moment when we hover over a data point, you'll see the tooltip displaying just the price of the property. So that doesn't really give us much insight into the data that we'd like to know. So what we can do instead is choose to create our own custom tooltip within the Chart.JS plugin. And this is by far my favorite feature of the Chart.JS plugin itself, as it allows you to customize whatever data you would like to display to your end users. So if I was to jump back into my bubble editor, when I'm adding a custom tooltip, what I can do is just move my element inspector to the side, and I will need to add in a smaller group element next to our chart, or anywhere on the page for that matter. I will update the style of this to be group border, and I'll be calling this group tooltip 1. And essentially anything that's displayed within this group can be displayed in our chart when we hover over a data point. And because, as I'll show you in a moment, you can integrate any element with the chart itself, you can really get creative as to what data you can display on this custom tooltip. And so the first data point I'd like to add to our tooltip is just a summary of the actual property type that we're hovering over in our chart. So if I scroll on up to our visual elements and add in a text element onto this group here, what I can do is start by typing in the static word property type, semicolon. You can see I've just got a small typo there. And then after adding in this static value, I can insert dynamic data to display the property type of the data point that we're hovering over. So if I insert dynamic data, what I'd like to do is perform a search in our database for all of the property price data. And now essentially what I'd like to do is identify the unique property that we're currently hovering over in our chart. And I'd like to display the property type of that. And so a great way to identify the unique property itself is by adding a custom constraint here. So when we're searching through our database, I'd only like to return one property where the price equals the value of the data point that we're currently hovering. So if I jump back into my demo editor, you'll see that all of these prices are unique. And so because no two prices are the same, if I was to search for the property where the price is $800,000, it's only going to return one value, which I can then display the property type for that value. So if I jump back into Bubble again, what I can do is identify when the price is the same value as our dynamic single series chart, which is the chart that we're currently working in. And this is where you'll start to see the power of the Chart.JS plugin's integration with chart elements themselves. So you can choose to select data from any item that's hovered or clicked within the chart. And in this case, I'll be selecting from the hover item Y value. So if you remember, the Y value was the price. And then once we've selected that value, what I'd like to do is display the property type. And then because this tooltip is just being created in a group, we can customize the formatting of this to whatever different styling we would like. So I can open up our rich text editor here. I can choose to bold the property type text. I can save that. I can also expand our tooltip out if I would like. And I could even make this copy smaller as well. I could drag that out. And now below the dynamic text where we're displaying the type of property, what I'd like to do is identify the city that this property is within. So I'm going to copy our existing text element here, just drag this down. And then I can just update the static text here to display the word city. And then what I'd like to do is identify the city for the value that's currently being hovered in our scatter chart. So once again, I'll be searching through our property data, and I'll be identifying the unique property based on its price. Only this time though, instead of displaying the property type, I will scroll on down and display the city for that property. And then finally below this, I'd like to add in the actual price of the property itself, which is fairly straightforward to grab. So I'm going to copy this text element once again, just drag this down, and then I will update the static text here to display the word price. And in this case, I can backspace the dynamic value that we have there, because the price is as simple as inserting dynamic data, selecting from our scatter chart, and just displaying its hovered Y value. And of course, because this is just a standard text element, we can choose to format this as a currency. We can add in our thousands separator and also choose the type of currency that we'll be displaying. In this case, I'm going to select dollars. I can then close that. And then finally within our tooltip, there's one last little visual element I'd like to add, and that is just a color of the data point that we're hovering. So if I was to select all of our text elements and just move those across to the side, I would like to then add another group within our existing group here. I'm just going to drag this out as a long rectangle. And then what I can do is remove the style of this group, because I would like to select a custom color that this group will display. So at the moment, it's just displaying a flat color, which is the default white option. But what I can do, of course, is insert dynamic data and display the color of the hovered data point in our scatter chart. So I'll be selecting from our dynamic single series chart, and I will then select the hovered item series color, and that should be the blue color of the data point in our scatter chart. Finally, I can then close off the height of our group. I might make this rectangle just a little bit longer, and then I can move our text across so it is nice and tight next to our rectangle there. And then finally, I can just close off the width of our group as well. Now, at the moment, this group is just displaying on our page like a regular group within Bubble. So it's currently visible to anyone viewing our application. In order to add this as a custom tooltip where it's only displayed when a data point is hovered, we'll need to expose the HTML ID attribute and then link that to our scatter chart. Now, in order to expose the HTML attribute, what you'll need to do is jump over to your settings page within your Bubble editor, open up your general settings option, and then right above the setting where you'll be adding in your Google Maps API keys, you'll see an option here to expose the ID attribute for HTML elements. You'll just need to check and enable this option. And what this allows you to do then is at the bottom of your element inspector, you'll see an option to create a unique ID attribute for each element. So in this case, I'm going to be calling this tooltip 1. And then I'm going to highlight all of that text and copy it. And then if I open up our chart here, you'll see a field that allows you to add in a custom tooltip HTML ID. So I'm then going to paste in that value, and it's as simple as that. Now, if I preview my Bubble demo editor once again, and then scroll on down to my dynamic scatter chart here and hover over any values, you'll see that we're now displaying the property type for this data point, as well as the city and the price of it. And then if I'm to hover over different values, you'll see it will update accordingly. And of course, I can see that at the expensive end of my spectrum, you could buy a home in LA, or I can see that there's an option down here where there's a home in Texas with more square footage for a cheaper price. Now, I haven't been too concerned about the actual formatting of my tooltip here, but as you can see, you can display whatever dynamic data you would like, and it can pull values from not only the chart itself, but also any dynamic values you have stored within your database. So if you'd like to display something like a profile photo from a user, you can easily reference that data for your tooltip. Now, if I jump back into my Notion checklist here, I'm going to check off that we've not only created our first single dynamic series scatter chart, but we've also ran through the process of creating our own custom tooltips, which just allow us to display a preview of whatever data we would like as it's being hovered within our scatter chart. The next chart I'd like to run you through is just a connected scatter chart. And this is going to be a fairly quick process, because when I'm building this chart, what I'd like to do is just create a copy of our existing chart here. So the dynamic single series chart with the property prices. If I was to copy the group with the chart within it, I can drag this down on our page, and then I will update the name of this chart to be called Connected Scatter. And then the process of actually turning this into a connected scatter chart is as simple as enabling a setting within our element inspector here. So if we scroll on down to the point settings here, we can select from our connected points option, which the default value is no. You can update this to be yes, And then if we were to preview this chart within our demo editor, we can scroll on down and you'll see that it's created a connected scatter chart. But the only problem is that these values are completely misaligned because we haven't sorted our options in any sort of custom format. So in order to create a connected scatter chart that makes sense, it's as simple as adding a filter on our data source that we're using to display the dynamic data from our database. So if we jump back into Bubble here and then scroll on down to the data source for our scatter chart here, what we can do here is open up the search for the property price data within our database. And I would just like to add a custom sorting to this data as we're pulling it from our database. And in this case, I'd like to sort it by its price with the descending value set as no. And then I'll need to do the same for our y-axis as well. So I'll be sorting this by its price with the descending value of no. And now if I was to preview this chart once again, you'll now see that the connected chart actually makes sense. So it's connected from the cheapest property, which was our Texas home here, all the way through to our most expensive property, which was the home in LA. But that's as simple as the process is for creating a connected scatter chart. You'll just need to remember that by default, it doesn't just connect the data points from left to right. You do need to create your own custom sorting on the data source itself. But if we jump back into Notion, I'd like to check off that we've finished adding our connected scatter chart, because I'd like to move on to one of my personal favorite scatter charts throughout this build today, and that is the dynamic multi-series scatter chart. So at the moment, I've ran us through the process of creating a single series dynamic scatter chart, where we were just pulling in all of the data that we had stored for our properties in our database here. But what if I would like to create a comparison of two different cities to each other on our chart? And instead of having to hover over each data point to view what city that is within our custom tooltip, we could create a scatter chart that plots out two different cities and then updates the style of the data point that's displayed. So this could be either our blue circles or our purple triangles. But for this example, what I'd like to do is just create a comparison of the property prices and square footage for both the cities of New York and San Francisco. And so if we jump into our bubble editor, I'm going to streamline the process to get started by just copying the second chart that we'd added in. So I'll be selecting from the group that that chart sits within. I'll then just move this down on our page. Move that down below our chart there. And then I'll be updating the name of this chart to be called Dynamic Multi-Series. And now if we were to scroll on down to the data source of this chart, you'll see that we only have one field here to add in a single data source. But what I'd like to do is create two different data sources for this chart so we can compare two different cities to one another. Now, I have an example of the experience I'd like to create over in a separate bubble editor here. So this is essentially a multi-series scatter chart where we're displaying the price and square footage for different apartments in New York and San Francisco. So you can clearly see which properties are based in San Francisco and which are in New York. And the way that I'm pulling in the data sources for this particular chart here isn't through the element inspector. So if I jump back into my other bubble editor here, what I'll need to do is remove these values stored within my element inspector. So I'm just going to delete all that dynamic data, because what we'll need to do is load in two separate values through our workflow editor. So if I open up our workflow tab here, I'd like to run a workflow that's triggered every time the page is loaded. So essentially, whenever a user opens up this page, I would like to load some data into our scatter chart. I can then select to add in an action, and I'll type in the word scatter, and I'll be choosing from the first option to add update a data series to a scatter chart. Then what I'll need to do, of course, is choose which chart I'd like to load this data into. And this will be our dynamic multi-series chart that we just copy and pasted into our page. And then much the same as the data source for our dynamic single series chart, I'll need to search through our database for all of the property data and display the square footage on our x-axis and the property price on our y-axis. But before I do that, I'm going to need to identify a series name for each unique value I would like to add to this chart. So in my instance, there will be 2 series. I'll be loading in the value for a New York property and one for a San Francisco property. So the first series will be called New York. And then once I've added in the series itself, I can choose to search through our database for the values we'll be displaying on our x-axis. So this will be all the square footage in our database that belongs to a property where the city is in New York. So I'll be inserting dynamic data, I'll perform a search through our database, and I'll be searching for all the property price data. But in this case, what I'd like to do is add a constraint and identify only the properties where the city equals, and then I'll remove the dynamic operator option, and then type in the word New York. And now this static text here will of course need to be the exact same value as the city I have stored within my database, just making sure that I have all the correct capitalization. But now that I'm searching for all the properties where the city is in New York, I would like to display all of those results, its square footage on our x-axis. And then for the y-axis, I'd like to do the same thing again. I'll be searching for all of the property price data where the city equals. I will remove the dynamic operator and type in the word New York. And then from here, I would like to display its property price data. And as it stands, I'm happy to leave the point style here as the default option, which is just a blue circle. But once I've loaded in the property data for New York, I'm going to need to add another step to our workflow. I'll be once again typing into add update a scatter chart point. The element that I'll be adding a data series to is our dynamic multi-series chart. And the series name in this case is all of the properties that are based in San Francisco. So I'll be typing in the word San Francisco as our series name. And one thing I would just like to note, and if you open up the documentation for this field here, is that each of your series within your workflow steps will need to have a unique name. If you were to, let's say, have 2 series with the exact same names, instead of displaying 2 separate data points, it's just going to overwrite the existing data point with the same name and display the last step within your workflow that contains the same series name. But of course, in our example today, I've got our New York series name and then our San Francisco series name, which are 2 unique values. And now in order to search for our X values, I will need to insert dynamic data. I'll be once again performing a search through our database for all the property price data, where the city equals, and in this case, I'll be typing in the manual option, San Francisco. And then for our x-axis, I'll be displaying the square footage of all these San Francisco properties. And then for our y-axis, I'll be inserting dynamic data, searching through all the property price data, and then I'll once again only be searching for the properties where the city equals, and then I'll type in San Francisco, and then I will be displaying all of the prices of the San Francisco properties. Now, in order to differentiate between the data points on my chart, I'll be updating the point style here to be a triangle, and I would like the color of this triangle to be a green. I can then copy the series point color and paste that into our point border color. And now if we were to preview our demo editor, you'll see how when this page is loaded, that workflow will run, and then it will then store the value within our multi-series scatter chart here. So over in our demo editor, I'm going to scroll on down to our multi-series chart, and you can see here in our legend that we have a clear differentiator between the 2 different data points within our chart. So the green triangles are the San Francisco properties, so I can get a good idea as to what the square footage is and the price of those properties. And then the blue circles are of course our New York properties. Now, instead of creating a custom tooltip for this chart, what I'd like to do is instead just add some custom data labels, which just displays the number of square footage above each data point. Because when you're working with a scatter chart, if the data point isn't exactly on a line with a metric, it can sometimes be a little difficult to identify what the value of that data point is. And data labels are pretty straightforward to add within the scatter charts through the Chart.JS plugin. What we'll need to do is open up our bubble editor. And then when we've selected our chart here, we will need to scroll on down to the data labels section of our element inspector here. So within our data labels here, you can once again customize the values that you'll be displaying. And what I'd like to do in this example is just display the word square footage as the X series. So by default, I can see it has kilometers stored as the unit after our X value. In this case, I just like to add in the abbreviation for square footage. I can then also just remove the default option after our Y value here. And now in order to activate the data labels, we'll need to do two quick things. The first is identify which particular label text we'll be displaying. So if we select the show documentation option here, you can see we'll need to add a corresponding value where we'll be displaying a data label. So in this case, it can be our series name, the X or Y value. For our example here, I would like to display the data value after our X value. So I'm just going to type in the word X. And of course, because we have the square footage abbreviation for our X value, that will now display. But the second setting we'll need to change is within our workflow editor itself. So if we open up the workflow tab, you'll see an option here when we were loading the different data points where you can choose to show data labels or not. The default setting for this is no, so we'll be switching that to yes. And I'll need to do that, of course, for both steps within our workflow. So I'll be selecting the other step in our workflow to be yes. And now if I was to preview our demo editor once again, I can now see that the custom data labels have been added into the values in our chart. So now I can just get a clear idea as to what the exact square footage is for this particular property in that city. Now, I'm not too concerned about customizing any other styling of this particular chart, but after we've added in this multi-series scatter chart, I'm going to jump over to my Notion checklist and tick off that we've added in our dynamic multi-series chart, as well as walk through the process of adding custom data labels into our chart, which can just be a nice alternative to creating a custom tooltip. The next feature I'd like to walk us through though is just the process of storing values through click events within a chart. So I have a good example within my different bubble editor that I had shown you before, where I have the dynamic multi-series chart we've just created. And I have a group beside this that will display the value of the last hovered point on this chart, as well as the last click point. So if I was to hover over this San Francisco property, you'll see that it will store the value of that data point in our group. If I was to then hover over the New York property, it would also update that. But if I was to click on this New York property, it would then update the value stored in our last click point, which means I can then hover over any other properties and just get a good comparison over the value and price of those properties based on their square footage. And this is actually a fairly straightforward process to create. Thanks to the Chart.JS plugin, this is all handled within the actual chart itself. You don't need to worry about creating custom states to store any values, which just simplifies the whole process. So if I was to jump back into my existing bubble editor that I was working in here, I can open up our design tab and just scroll on down to the last chart that we'd added in, which was the multi-series chart, displaying both the properties for New York and San Francisco only. And then beside this chart, what I'd like to do is just add in another group element. I'm just going to stretch this out. And I'll update the style of this to be the group border option once again. But to simplify the process of our tutorial, I'm just going to display some static text in this group and then just update it when a user has interacted with the chart. So I'm just going to start by adding in a text element in our group. And this text will display last hovered point. And then I'll just move that to the side of our group. And then I will just copy that text element, drag this down, make sure it's in line with our previous text element. So I'll then choose to insert dynamic data. And storing that value is as simple as just choosing from our chart. So this was the dynamic multi-series chart. What I'd like to do is just display the hovered item series name. Because if you remember, when we were loading the data in our workflow, the series name was the actual city. So this will be either New York or San Francisco. So in our design tab here, this will now display city and then the corresponding value. Of course, I can then update the styling of this if I'd like. So I could just bold the static city text there. I'll save that. And then what I'd like to do below this is just display the square footage of this property as well as its price. So I'm going to copy this text element, drag this down, and then I'm going to just remove all of the text within that. I'll be inserting dynamic data. And because I'm displaying the square footage, I'll be selecting from our scatter dynamic multi-series chart, its hovered item X value, which is a number, because that is the square footage. And then I will add in a space and just type in the abbreviation for square feet. I'll once again open up our rich text editor and just bold the square foot abbreviation. And then finally, I'd like to display the price of the property that's being hovered. So I can copy the city text that we have here before. I'll drag this down. I will update the static text to display the word price. And then I will just remove the dynamic text. And I'd like to display the data from the dynamic multi-series chart, its hovered Y value. And then of course I'll be formatting that as a currency because that will be a price of a property. I'll add in my thousands separator and also my currency prefix. And then I'll also just need to add a space in between the static text and my dynamic text there. And then finally, I'll just straighten all of these text elements up so they're in line with one another. Perfect. And now in terms of adding in the last click point, it's as simple as just selecting all of our text elements here, creating a copy of those and moving those across to the right-hand side of our group. And then I'll be selecting from our static heading here and updating the text within it to display the word last clicked point. And now in this case, what I'd like to do is display the value of the city that was last clicked, not hovered. So I'm going to leave the same static text of our city, but where it's selecting the hovered item series name, I'm going to type in the word clicked and instead display the clicked item series name. So it will now store the value of the last clicked item. And as I mentioned before, I won't need to worry about creating any custom states within any groups to store that information. It'll automatically do that through the chart itself. Then for the square footage, instead of displaying the hovered item X value name, I'm going to type in the word clicked and display the clicked item X value. And then finally for the price, I would like to display the clicked item Y value instead of the hovered item Y value. Now if I was to close this group here and then open up our demo editor, we can get a first-hand look as to how this experience functions. So over in my demo editor here, you can see that there's currently just no value stored within our group. But if I was to hover over a value, it would update that accordingly. And then of course it will store that last hovered point. So if I was to hover over a New York property and move my mouse away, it would store that value within our group. And then finally, if I was to click on a value, it would also update the current value that's stored there. So now we can continually hover over different properties and get a good comparison as to the value that they offer. Now, I haven't focused too much on the styling of this group here, but as I'd shown you in my previous bubble editor, you can get quite creative as to how you would like to style each group. And as you could see before, I had collapsible groups stacked on top of each other when there wasn't a value hovered or clicked. But if I jump back into my Notion doc, I'm going to check off that we've ran through the process of storing clicked values through events, which means we can finally move on to the last chart that I'd like to run us through in this tutorial today. And this is the time series on the x-axis scatter chart. So within this chart, I'd just like to display a series of data points across a date range. And then I'll also take the time to show how you can integrate some date time picker elements to filter the dates that are displayed within this chart. So let's just jump right back into our bubble editor and we can get started. Over in my editor here, I'm going to need to create a new group and a new chart at the bottom of my page. But first I'd like to just show you the data I'll be using for this time series chart. Because we are in fact displaying a list of data over a series of dates, I've created another data type within my database, which is called movie ticket sales. And now within this data type, I just have two simple data fields. One is a date, and then the other is the total number of sales that were recorded on that date. And if I open up my app data here and select to open the all movie ticket sales data, just zoom in on my database, you'll see that I've added in a series of different entries for every single day throughout the month of August. So I have each unique date where there's just one entry per day, and then I have a number beside this, which is the total number of ticket sales recorded for that date. And so this would be pretty straightforward to add onto a time series scatter chart. I'm just going to zoom out of my database, open up our design tab, and once again, I'll be adding a group element onto the bottom of our page here. I'll quickly need to update the style of the group to be the group border option. And then of course I can select one of the Chart.JS elements, which is the chart scatter / point element. I'll drag that into my group. And then I'll be updating the name of this to be called chart scatter time series. And like always, I'll just be updating my legend to display at the bottom. And now because I'm only loading in one data source for this particular chart, I can configure this within the element inspector itself. I don't need to worry about having to use the workflow editor to do this. So if I scroll right down to the bottom of this element inspector, I'm going to remove the static options that we have listed here for our X and Y values. So I'll start by just removing all of the X values, and I would like to insert dynamic data like we had done before. Only this time I'll be searching through my database for all of the movie ticket sales data. And I would like to sort these by the date data field and set the descending value to be no, so that way they're in chronological order. And then of course I would like to display the value of each unique date. So I will be selecting from the date option here. But one thing I'd also like to do is just make sure the dates are formatted correctly. So I'm going to type in the word extract and select the extract option. And then if we select from our component dropdown, I'm going to select from the Unix timestamp option, which just ensures that these are formatted consistently. And when I add in some date time picker elements below this chart, I'll also make sure that the formatting is extracted in this format. So that way the dates remain consistent throughout the build. But once I've added in my X values, I can close that. I will then need to remove the static options in my Y values. And in this instance, I'll be using the Y-axis on my chart to display the total ticket sales. So once again, I'll be inserting dynamic data and searching through all of the movie ticket sales in my database. I'll be sorting these by the date data field with the descending value to be set to no. And then I would like to display the sales data field. And now before we preview this chart, I'm going to update the series name here to be called Movie Ticket Sales. And while I'm here, what I could also do is just scroll on up and choose to make this a connected scatter chart, just so we can see a nice flow throughout our time series. So I'm going to select the option to be yes. And of course, because we have sorted our movie ticket sales by the date in chronological order, the connected points should flow nicely from left to right. But while I'm also here, I'm going to scroll on up to the values displayed before and after our Y unit, because the Y-axis itself is displaying a total number of ticket sales. So I'd like to add a dollar symbol before that unit. And then I'll also need to edit the remaining axis settings here, because our X-axis unit is currently set to be a number, whereas I would like this to be set as a date and time, because of course we're creating a time series chart in this instance. And now below this, you'll see an option to format the X-axis date format in whatever way you would like. So the Chart.JS plugin will actually include some examples here for you. I'm going to just remove all of these options and create my own custom format. So I'm going to type in the first three letters of the month, followed by the date, so the letter D. I'll then add a comma and type in the year, so it'll just be 4 Ys. And when we preview the chart, you'll just see that that'll be correctly formatted across our X-axis. So let's now go and take a look at what this chart looks like within our Bubble demo editor. Over in my demo editor here, you can see that we have a chart displaying our movie ticket sales. And on the X-axis, we have a list of all the dates throughout the month of August. And of course on our y-axis we have the total number of ticket sales registered in dollars. And because I've formatted this chart as a connected scatter chart, you can see that it clearly flows across throughout the month, so it's easy to track the revenue for each particular date. But while we're here, what I'd also like to do is show you how we can filter this chart by a unique date range. So let's say if you as a user would like to inspect the ticket sales from August 1st through to August 15th, we can add two date time pickers below this element that allows us to update the date range that we're displaying within the chart. So if we just jump back into our bubble editor, we can scroll down to our input elements and choose to add in not one but two date time pickers below our chart. So I'll be calling the first one the date time picker minimum. So this is the minimum date range. And then I'll just copy this, drag it across, and I'll call the next one date time picker maximum. And now if I select back into my time series scatter chart here and scroll on down to the axis settings, you'll see a field here that allows us to set both the minimum and maximum values across our x-axis, which is currently formatted as a date and time. So what we'll be doing is we'll be setting the minimum value to be the minimum date time pickers input. So if I scroll on down, I can choose from our date time picker minimum. I would like to select that it is the value that's stored within that input field. And then similar to before, what I'd also like to do is extract from it the date formatted in the Unix format. So that way it now matches the same formatting from the configuration we added on our x-axis data source. And then from here we can close that, and then we'll do the exact same thing for our maximum value. So we can scroll on down and select from the date time picker max. I will choose its value, and then I'll need to type in the word extract, choose that option, and then I'll be selecting from the Unix timestamp format. And that's all we'll need to do here. We can now jump back into our demo editor and preview what this chart experience looks like. So back in my development environment here, I can select from both of our date time pickers. I would like this one's minimum value to be the 1st of August. And then I can select that the second date time picker's value should be the 15th of August. And now you can see that this chart has updated accordingly. So I now have a snapshot of the movie ticket sales for the first half of the month. Back in my Notion doc now, I'm going to check off that I finished adding in our last scatter chart, which was the time series on the x-axis, which is just detrimental if you're planning on displaying data for a date range across any scatter chart. And that wraps up everything that I wanted to cover within our tutorial today. As you can see, it's never been easier to create your own custom scatter charts using the Chart.JS plugin by Techblocks. As I'd shown you earlier throughout the tutorial, I'd always recommend checking out the Techblocks documentation and demo editors. They're filled with rich examples that can provide you with some additional insights while you're getting started. And of course, I'll be sure to include a link to that in the description below. But in the meantime, be sure to hit that subscribe button if you'd like to see more helpful Bubble tutorials. And as always, I wish you all the best on your own no-code journey.